Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we'll be talking about a major world reality, something that's been prominent in the media recently, the refugee crisis. We'll be talking about how we as Christ followers can be active participants in welcoming and then walking alongside refugees as they arrive into our cities and neighborhoods, and how we can share the good news of the gospel in word and deed. Just before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Is your church or missions committee looking for ways to stay on top of what's happening in missions around the world? The Mission Network News is a great resource for learning about what's happening in missions across the globe. Visit globalmissionspodcast.com to learn more about this great resource. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, our guest is Matthew Soerens. And for those of you that haven't met Matthew, he serves now as the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. In this role, he helps evangelical churches understand the realities of refugees and immigration as he responds in ways guided by biblical values. He's originally from Wisconsin and now lives in Aurora, Illinois with his wife, Diana, and their two kids. Matthew, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Our topic today is, how can the North American church respond to the refugee crisis? And we would want to say respectfully, we realize some of our listeners are from outside of North America. Our focus today will be especially on the United States and Canada, but we hope there will be helpful ideas and principles underlying our discussion today, even if you're not in North America. Matthew is an author. He co-authored a recent book entitled Seeking Refuge on the Shores of the Global Refugee Crisis. Matthew, let's start with some definitions, please. Could you define for us what is a refugee?
Sure. So under international law, as well as the law in both the U.S. and Canada, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their country of origin because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution that specifically is on account of their race, their religion, their political opinion, their national origin, or their social group. So it's a subset of all immigrants. Immigrants are people who've left their country to reside in another. But what's distinct about refugees is that the reason they've had to flee is because of persecution for one of those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Some sort of danger to them or to their loved ones?
That's right. And not even just any danger. If you're fleeing a natural disaster, as sympathetic as that may be, it doesn't qualify you as a refugee because it's not persecution per se.
I see. Okay. Well, I wonder if, you could give us an update, a little bit about the current situation regarding refugees, how this dynamic is unfolding, and especially as it relates to North America.
Sure. So globally, the UN's Refugee Agency estimates that there's about 21.3 million refugees in the world today, which is an unprecedented number. Since anyone has been tracking these statistics, there's never been that many refugees in the world. Wow. And that doesn't include those who are internally displaced, so people who have fled their homes because of persecution but are still within the boundaries of their country. That's probably about another 40 million globally. But here in North America, the resettlement, meaning someone is brought to a third country as the best solution, having lived often in a refugee camp or as a refugee in an urban context for many years. Resettlement is the solution for only a very small percentage of the world's refugees. It's less than 1% in any given year. But both Canada and the United States are among the primary recipient countries for refugee resettlement. Last year, the United States, in the fiscal year 2016, brought in 85,000 refugees, which is a slight increase over the previous year. In Canada, the numbers have actually increased very significantly in the last year or so, and that's been under the leadership of your government in Canada, particularly in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. There's been more than 30,000 refugees brought into Canada, which per capita would be a lot higher than the United States.
No question that Mr. Trudeau's policies have headed in that direction, and especially we've seen in light of the Syrian refugee crisis. That's what's been publicized broadly here.
And I should probably add, in the U.S., there's a little bit of uncertainty right now. Obviously, we have a new president-elect coming in January, and he has the authority under U.S. law to basically set the number of refugees coming to the U.S. President Obama has set that number at 110,000 for the current year, but it will be up to President-elect Trump once he's in office to decide if he wants to pursue the goal that President Obama set or to revise that. And so we really don't know. Obviously, refugees were a theme in the election in some significant ways, but we really don't know at this point what that will mean.
Sure. Well, that timestamps this particular podcast. We're recording at the end of November in 2016, in the interim between President-elect Trump's election and his inauguration. I wonder if we could move from the generalities of government policy and move toward the church, Matthew. What is the North American church's role in responding to this crisis?
Yeah, I really believe, and we really believe at World Relief, that the church globally, and the North American church as an important part of that, really could be at the center of the solution to the refugee crisis. And that's true both as we support our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are responding, in many cases, to much larger numbers of refugees and asylum seekers, but also as we respond to those who are being resettled into our communities. Our vision at World Relief is that every refugee family that lands at an airport in North America would be welcomed by a team from a local church. We call that a good neighbor team that basically will commit to, even before they arrive, setting up an apartment, helping furnish things, and then being there to welcome them at the airport, sending that message from the moment they step foot on our soil that they are welcome here. And then for at least the first several months to a year that they're in the country, really committing to being their friends and helping them adjust culturally, helping them to understand the language, and working alongside others. And in the U.S. context, it's with the help of a resettlement agency like World Relief to adjust to the country, to find work, to become economically self-sufficient. And there's parallel programs in Canada as well. In fact, in some ways, the churches are even more involved through the private sponsorship program in Canada. But we think it's a unique opportunity to live out the Great Commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves, and also to stand with the persecuted church, because many of the refugees coming in are already believers, and that's why they've been forced to flee. But also a Great Commission opportunity to make disciples of all nations right in our communities.
Mm-hmm. So there are a whole bunch of potential good fruits to come from this difficult situation.
Yeah, we really believe that in the midst of a really horrific situation, that God can and is working redemptively. And we've seen that in North America. We've seen that in Europe. We've seen it in the Middle East and in other parts of the world that aren't getting as much attention. I mean, we talk about the refugee crisis and people tend to think about Syria, and that is the largest country forcing people out right now. But there are also very large numbers of refugees fleeing South Sudan right now, or other parts of the world that maybe aren't getting as much news coverage.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Our media, we can only bear so much through the media for a period of time, right? And
that's right.
Sudan, we haven't heard as much about, certainly not as much as Syria in recent days. I did notice, Matthew, that you said that the church could be stepping up and meeting everyone at the airport, so to speak. I wonder whether you get a sense, are we embracing the opportunity? Are you encouraged? And where might you have concerns on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of local churches throughout North America doing amazing things. And I, as a credit to the Canadians listening, I actually think the Canadian church is stepping up to this more enthusiastically than the U.S. church. But there's certainly room to grow, to fully live out the potential for the situation. In the U.S., we actually commissioned some research of Protestant pastors in the United States. And we did this with Lifeway Research. And they asked these pastors, first of all, they asked what they thought about the refugee crisis. And fully 86% affirmed that as Christians, we have a biblical responsibility to care for refugees and other foreigners.
Okay.
But the next finding was less encouraging. They found that only 8% of Protestant pastors in the U.S. said their local church was currently involved in serving refugees in their community. So there's this rather significant gap between our theology, what we believe is right based on Scripture, in our practice, what we're actually doing. So I think I would love to see that gap close. If we had 86% of the churches in the United States actively welcome refugees, I think we would see some remarkable fruit. And again, in Canada, it's a similar opportunity. I expect it's slightly higher than 8% that are currently engaged, but there's certainly a lot of room for improvement there as well.
Well, you've mentioned some of the practical ways already in some of your previous comments there. As people are arriving as refugees, I wonder if you'd review for us just some of the immediate needs that they have as they arrive to a new country.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to think through that is just to apply the golden rule, if you will, and think about how we would want to be treated if, without much notice at all and with very few of our possessions, we were to suddenly land into a new country, having been forced to flee our own. So the needs are to learn a new language. English in North America is probably most useful. To find a job, because people are expected to be economically self-sufficient quite quickly. Right. To adjust to a new culture, which goes way beyond just language. Some of the countries that people are coming from have very different cultures than the Western cultures we have in the United States and Canada. There's dynamics with children who have to get into school, need to adjust to a new academic system. A lot of refugees are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other effects from having been traumatized and having been persecuted. So there's some needs for counseling and mental health support. And then I would say perhaps the biggest need is friendship. A lot of refugees will tell you they've got lots of services and support and they appreciate that, but what they need is a friend. They need someone who they can talk to. And that feeds into all that cultural adjustment and language learning, all those things. Sure. And there's also a spiritual opportunity there as well. Again, many of the refugees who are being resettled to North America are already believers. And we actually have a lot to learn, I think, from brothers and sisters who've been persecuted for their faith. Yes. But many others are not yet Christians. They might come from a Muslim background or a Hindu background or a Buddhist background. And we've found that we have this unique opportunity as we love and welcome people. It's frankly rare that sooner or later that family or that individual isn't going to ask the question of, so why are you being so kind to us? Why was it the local church who met me at the airport and who has helped me to get onto my feet? And we get to point them to Jesus. And we have seen families or individuals and sometimes whole families make that decision to follow Jesus because they've been welcomed so well and loved so well by a team from a local church.
That's beautiful fruit for sure. Just as I was jotting some notes here about the things you were mentioning, there, maybe with the exception of special counseling, where there might be some professional intervention that would really be helpful for someone who has been in a highly stressful situation and they need some counseling to unpack that. Most of what you mentioned could be provided by quote unquote normal people, just churchgoers. There aren't special skills training required necessarily for this.
No, or at least the level of training that would be necessary is, it's pretty minimal. It's a basic cultural orientation. You want to understand who the people you're going to be serving are and where they're coming from and their worldview. But this is definitely something that lay people can and are being a part of. In fact, at World Relief, we have lots of professionals who are fantastic, but they're also overwhelmed with the number of refugees that we're serving. And if it wasn't for teams from a local church, we wouldn't be able to serve people really nearly as well as we would like to. Yeah. Because if we have a caseworker who has a number of cases to serve, they're just not going to be able to be the best friend of every refugee that arrives. That's just not realistic. But it is quite realistic that a team from a local church could be the best friends to a newly arrived family. And we have seen that. And, at World Relief, we usually ask church teams to make at least a 6-month commitment. But our not so secret hope is actually that becomes a lifelong reciprocal friendship that might go on right into eternity.
Right. Matthew, in the discussion guide that comes with your book, which is downloadable, it says this: the author asks us to consider the ways in which a Syrian refugee may become an agent of God's mission in the world. Can you give us an example of what this might look like?
Sure. I think one of the best examples might be to look not at the Syrian experience, but to look at the refugees who were arriving a generation ago. One who comes to mind was my colleague Thai, who is now actually working with World Relief in Memphis, but he was resettled as a refugee from Laos as a small child in Tennessee and welcomed by a Baptist church there. And as he went on, got his education, actually went to seminary, he's got his doctorate now. But he's become a pastor and is pastoring a multi-ethnic church in the Memphis area alongside working with World Relief. But a lot of people in his church are actually Bhutanese refugees. And at least many of them have become Christians, having come from a background that was primarily not Christian. And at least one of them is now actually serving as a co-pastor with him in that church and is preparing to return to his country of origin to share the good news in the country he came from. So it's sort of a full cycle within a generation. And I think you see that with the experience of refugees coming from Southeast Asia, in the 1970s and 80s. Vietnam, for example, many of those refugees were welcomed by churches in North America. And Vietnamese in the United States, or I don't know the stat for Canada, but Vietnamese in the United States are far more likely to be Christian than the Vietnamese in Vietnam. And a big part of that is that so many of them were welcomed by local churches when they arrived here. And I think we could see that same cycle with the Syrians who are arriving now in the US and even larger numbers in Canada. 20, 30 years from now, they may be the ones planting churches and reaching the next group of people.
Right. It's a beautiful story of longer range fruit. Who would have necessarily thought of or envisioned all of that when they met these dear folks at the airport, so to speak?
That's right.
Fruit coming from that. And now we similarly have an opportunity to meet some of those folks at the airport, as it were. We would find at times that people here in North America may be hesitant. And I wonder what you've discovered as far as what makes us hesitant. What's stopping us from engaging more adequately in this whole situation?
So I think that there are at least two major concerns that come up quite often, especially in the current environment. The first would be economic, and the second would be related to security. So in terms of economics, the basic concern, which I think is quite understandable, is a lot of North American folks would say, we want to be helpful, we want to be compassionate, but we're struggling economically. Can we afford to extend help to others? The interesting thing is, if you look at the economic research on this, the vast majority of economists will tell you that the net economic impact of refugees or of other immigrants is actually positive for the country that receives them. And that's not always true in the very short term. So there are some costs up front to when refugees arrive. But because most of these people are going to be, they're going to become American or become Canadian and be living and working and consuming things in that local economy for the rest of their lives in most cases, which could be 30, 40, 50, 60 years. At least in the US context, I know there's been studies that it's somewhere around year 13 when the net contributions that a refugee is making, that is what they're paying in taxes, exceed the net costs, what they're receiving in some sort of social services or public benefits.
Right.
So the costs may be weighted up front, but because they're going to live here the rest of their lifetime, it actually is in the long term in the economic interests of the U.S. Yep. Again, and part of that just goes to what, these are going to be consumers in local economies. They're going to buy cars and laundry detergent and smartphones and all those things that anyone else buys, and that adds to the overall economy of the country.
Yeah, very important then to have not just the short term in view, but the medium and long term, and as you noted before, eternal as well.
Absolutely. And I think that is an important caveat that even if refugees were bad for the economy, I don't think that would change the command of Jesus in Luke chapter 10 to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
Or it's quite clear from his story of the Good Samaritan that our neighbor includes those who are of a different ethnicity, a different language, a different religion, who are in need. And in that story, it certainly was not in the economic interest of the Good Samaritan to stop and help the guy beaten up on the side of the road.
Yeah, excellent example. Now, that's the economic side. Talk a little bit about the security concerns that might be there.
Sure. And I think that concern, it's interesting. I didn't hear this very much a year ago, but in the last year, at least in the U.S., it's become a huge concern for a lot of people, especially related to Syrian refugees. And the concern is basically, well, how do we know that those people aren't actually terrorists sneaking into our country to do us harm? And the reason I'm quite confident that they're not is the record of the vetting program that the U.S. government and the Canadian government has a very similar program. They cooperate together, actually. But there's a very strong vetting process that takes place before any refugee is admitted to North America. That process is coordinated, again, on the U.S. side. It's between the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, and Canada has all their counterpart entities that are doing that screening process abroad. That process happens before anyone is allowed onto an airplane. And again, I know the U.S. situation best, but in the U.S., it's the most thorough vetting process that any category of visitor or immigrant is required to undergo. So it's a little bit confusing to me that in 2015, we had about 70,000 refugees who went through that process and came to the United States. We had 70 million visitors enter the United States who went through a far less thorough screening. But for whatever reason, we've fixated most of our fears on the 70,000 out of those 70 million who already have been the most thoroughly vetted.
Well, that's quite an important observation, really. It puts it in context.
And I think you can also look at the history of that program. I mean, in the U.S., we've basically had our current refugee resettlement program since 1980. Since that time, there's been about 3 million refugees resettled to the United States. And there's been a grand total of 0 Americans who've ever been killed in a terrorist attack since that time, perpetrated by someone who came in through that refugee resettlement program. So that's not an ironclad guarantee that nothing bad could ever happen, but it does have a strong record. And I think part of that is the screening that goes into that. The other part is that these people have been welcomed. And that in some ways is the best antidote to any sort of ISIS rhetoric that you can imagine, that, you know, Americans are your enemies, or Christians are your enemies, or Canadians are your enemies. Because when you've been welcomed by a local church, people are not going to believe that. They're very much less likely to ever be radicalized when they have been welcomed by local Christians.
Mm-hmm. Well, great discussion on some of the fears that we may have as North Americans. I wonder if we turn this around just a little bit again and talk about some of these folks who are refugees. From your position and the learning you've done, what are some of the fears that they face as they are arriving here?
That's a great question, because I think there are a lot of fears on that side as well that we maybe don't talk about as much. Some of those are just simply the reality that it's entering a new country, a new culture. It can be very socially isolating to come to a new place where you don't speak the language. And I would say that's especially true the older that you are, because it just becomes harder. You know, if you're 65 or 70, realistically, you may never learn that second language, or, you know, the English, or I guess it could be French in some parts of Canada. It can be very, very difficult. So that's a fear. I think there's also a fear, particularly for those who are not Christians, of coming and being religious minorities in North America. So for a Muslim coming in, and, you know, it draws attention to them that a woman may be wearing a hijab, or, you know, otherwise be notable for being from somewhere else, especially at a time when our political discourse has been rather coarse on some of those questions. And I think there is a lot of fear especially among refugees arriving from the Middle East right now into the U.S. At least. I imagine there may be some similar dynamic in Canada. Mm-hmm. So those are very real fears as well. I mean, we've had politicians say things like, we're going to send them back. And realistically, there's checks and balances in place where that's not going to happen once someone has been screened and admitted to North America. But when you've already been kicked out of your country by a government, and an elected official starts saying, we're going to send those people back, that can actually revisit a lot of the trauma that they've already experienced. And I can tell them, don't worry, that's not actually going to happen. But that may not sound credible when they've had that experience in the past.
Right, right. Well, how important some of the things we spoke of before, someone who authentically cares and is willing to build trust, willing to be helpful, express kindness. Those seem like the natural ways that we can begin to diffuse some of those fears. I sure hope that the Lord's people will step into some of those places. I wonder, Matthew, if we get to some practical advice that you may have. If there is a church listening, or perhaps it's an individual and you're thinking about your church, they're listening to this interview and they wanted to take some first steps toward being involved in helping refugees and resettlement, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so again, it would probably vary a little bit whether you're in Canada or in the United States. But I would say in either case, there are organizations that work with the federal government. There's actually a lot more of them in Canada. It's a little bit more decentralized. There's 9 agencies nationally in the U.S., one of which is World Relief, who can help facilitate a church connecting to a refugee family that's arriving. And that doesn't necessarily happen in the U.S., at least in every community, but like World Relief, we're in about 26 cities around the United States. So that would be where I would suggest starting, because if you're in one of the communities where we are, we can very easily provide a little bit of training for a small group or for an individual as a volunteer. And we know exactly when those families are arriving at the airport. And, it's very easy for us to connect people in. And that would be true for the other resettlement agencies in the U.S. as well.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned there is training. If you would just describe what that might look like for a church or a small group that wanted to help, what might that look like?
Yeah. So in terms of training, much of what we would cover would be some of the things we're talking about even on this podcast, but then also looking at some of the specific contexts from which refugees will be coming from, understanding cultural cues, like if you're visiting this Burmese family's home, you should take off your shoes before you go in, because that you don't want to offend them unnecessarily. And then just, I think another part of training that's helpful is to understand how trauma works, because that is a real significant part of many refugees' experiences, having gone through some very serious trauma, and being sensitive to that is really important. I think those are the biggest thing: cultural understanding and some of the trauma-related issues that we try to go through with teams. And then also just clarifying responsibilities, knowing what the resources are in the community so that team knows, what services are available to this newly arrived family, where to go to find different things. So that's a lot of what we do with a training process.
Well, it's helpful to have a bit of an idea of what training might look like. And we will provide in the show notes lists of agencies both in Canada and the United States. Matthew's helping with that, putting together these lists so that if you would like to learn about an agency that is helping refugees and might be located close to you, you can check that list. Hopefully that would be helpful to some of you. Matthew, I wonder if there are any other resources that you would mention by way of reading articles or websites that you would point people to get acquainted with this whole movement and how they might help.
Sure. One that comes to mind that has been put together by a bunch of different Christian organizations as really a central landing spot for a lot of information on refugees, both in the U.S. and Canada, as well as elsewhere in the world, is called WeWelcomeRefugees.com. So I would encourage people to check out that website, and there's frequently asked questions there. There's information on different ways to engage, whether that's by volunteering, by providing donated household items, by providing financial support, by engaging internationally as well, engaging with the European crisis also. So I encourage people to check out that website.
Very good. Well, this has been a very helpful introduction to a big topic. It's very bright in the media, and it's important that we learn more about it. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us today. I just want to ask you quick before we let you go, if our listeners wanted to learn more from you, follow after you, so to speak, how can they do that?
Yeah, probably the best way to find me is on Twitter at Matthew Soerens.
And just to make sure that you're spelling Matthew's name right, it's Matthew Soerens, Soerens. You can find him on Twitter. Matthew, thanks so much for taking some time to help us learn some more about this today. We really appreciate you explaining some of these things.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
We hope that you have been informed and inspired by this episode about reaching out with care to arriving refugees. Remember that if you've been driving or riding while listening, or if you've missed any of the links or resources that Matthew mentioned, including the list of agencies serving refugees in the United States and in Canada, you can find these in the show notes on our website at globalmissionspodcast.com. Your engagement through encouragement and any suggestions is welcomed. Also, you can reach us through the same website or on our Facebook page, as well as on Twitter. Our handle there is at global_pod. Global_pod. That's it for today. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore the grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.